probably did that because it's incredibly difficult to film things on the moon.
Joe Rogan was among many Americans who believed the moon landing was faked. However, he changed his stance over the years after realizing that he was no expert when it came to understanding space travel, and that there was a fair chance that all the conspiracies around the moon landing were untrue. But that said, from weird footage of astronauts bouncing on the moon to the absence of stars in landing photographs, there's a lot that doesn't add up. Although NASA has tried to explain these discrepancies, millions of Americans, almost 30% of the population, still think the Apollo 11 mission was a farce. Why is it that even after 50 years of the historic moon landing, people still question its authenticity? Let's explore why the moon landing conspiracy is still alive, and what Joe Rogan found through his investigations. Ever since Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin voyaged to the moon on Apollo 11, Americans have been divided on the legitimacy of the moon landing. Some even went as far as proposing that NASA staged the Apollo 11 moonwalk in the Nevada desert. Many skeptics felt moon explorer Neil Armstrong took his giant step for mankind somewhere in Arizona. Before we dismiss these remarks as baseless conspiracy theories, we need to look at the political scenario in the U.S. at the time of Apollo 11's landing. The rivalry between the U.S. and the Soviet Union reached its pinnacle during the 1950s, with the Soviets marking history with successful space programs like the Sputnik 1 in October 1957, followed a month later by Sputnik 2. The U.S. was way behind the Russians in terms of space technology. NASA was founded in 1958, and only 3 years later launched Alan Shepard into space in May 1961. It all seemed to be happening too fast, so when John F. Kennedy announced that the U.S. would land a man on the moon and back before the decade was out, everyone agreed it was a tall claim. Although NASA was consuming 4% of the U.S. federal budget by the mid-60s, the Americans were facing one setback after another, including a launch pad fire that wiped out all 3 Apollo 1 astronauts. Meanwhile, the Soviets continued to achieve more firsts: the first woman in space in 1963 and the first spacewalk in 1965. This brings us back to the main question Americans can't stop asking. How did NASA send astronauts to the moon in 1969 despite the countless setbacks? Conspiracy theorists believe that the U.S. government became so frantic to take the lead in the space race that they faked the lunar landing.
The head engineers and the people that designed it, Wernher von Braun himself was saying how impossible it was just years before they did the moon landing.
If the lead engineer at NASA wasn't confident about the technology required for a crewed moon landing mission, how did the U.S. achieve the impossible in such a short time? Do you think Armstrong and Aldrin acted out the mission on a secret film either high in the Hollywood Hills or deep within Area 51? The conspiracy makes sense when you consider that after the first successful crewed mission, NASA gave up on returning to the moon entirely. Even amidst the glaring controversy of the Apollo 11 landing on the moon, why did NASA not attempt to quash the narrative by sending more astronauts to the moon? That question is definitely worth considering. And while you think about that, here's another piece of information that will allow you to view the moon landing through a different lens. The 1960s were not easy for the U.S., especially after the fiasco with the Vietnam War. Racial crisis and social upheaval had gripped the country viciously, and people were unhappy and disappointed with what was happening around them. At a time like this, the government needed to create a reason that would bring everyone together in celebration. And what better way to rekindle national spirit than to announce a successful moon landing, a feat no other country had achieved before?
Yes. Operation Northwoods was one that they were planning on blowing up a drone jetliner, blaming it on the Cubans. They were going to arm Cuban friendlies and have them attack Guantanamo Bay. They were going to sacrifice.
If the U.S. government was willing to risk American soldiers just to support a conflict that suited them politically, who is to say they didn't plant the fake moon landing to distract people from the repercussions of the Vietnam War? What made the lie, if it was one, even more foolproof, was the fact that all the details regarding Apollo 11 missions were available through NASA, so the public had no way to corroborate the information from any other sources. The first conspiracy theorist to come forward was an ex-NASA employee, Bill Kaysing. He was a journalist who had worked in the public relations office at Rocketdyne Inc., a NASA contractor in the early 1960s. Hence, when he published a pamphlet, We Never Went to the Moon, in 1974, everyone considered him a credible source. Kaysing argued that NASA didn't possess the technical expertise to execute the moon landing, which is why they created a monumental cover-up to conceal their weakness from the world. One anomaly that has been pointed out several times is the moment when the astronauts planted the American flag on the moon.
The astronauts planting the American flag on the moon actually happened in an air-conditioned studio.
Can you see how the flag is constantly moving? While that would be a completely ordinary sight here on Earth, the presence of air on the moon is unbelievable because it doesn't have an atmosphere. The lunar surface doesn't experience wind or precipitation like rain or snow. So, if there's no wind on the moon, what's making the flag move? Could it be the air conditioning system in a Nevada studio? Here's another one to pique your interest.
Sometimes we have two objects in a picture just a few feet from one another, and the shadows are going as much as 90 degrees different direction.
Here you can see the shadow cast by astronaut Neil Armstrong and another object that's out of shot. But something about these shadows doesn't make sense. Why are both objects casting shadows in different directions when the source of light is one, the sun? Shadows that are not parallel can be created by studio lighting, a light source that is relatively close, or by multiple light sources. We know that the sun is quite far and at the same distance from Armstrong as it is from the other object, which checks off the light source being relatively close. We also know that there is a single light source on the moon, which means the multiple light sources theory cannot be justified in this case, leaving only one plausible explanation. The unparalleled shadows were created by studio lighting. Then there is the problem with stars.
A committed Christian and a man obsessed. He and his disciples believe...
Shouldn't the sky be full of stars since there are no clouds to conceal them? Why is it that none of the NASA photographs show any stars in the sky? One theory is that it would have been impossible to recreate the glorious lunar landscape, so NASA didn't even try to attempt the optical illusion. These are just a few images and videos that look suspicious, and even Joe Rogan agrees that they don't make sense. In one podcast, he compared the different videos of astronauts on the Apollo 11 moon mission. In some instances, you can see them bouncing off the lunar surface as if they are moving on a trampoline. trampoline, and in others, you can see them waddle around on the surface like they're moving in half speed. Although Joe Rogan doesn't doubt the moon landing, he's confident that some of the images and videos released to the public are fake. His own theory is that the astronauts were unable to film on the lunar surface for some technical reasons, which is why it had to be done in a studio somewhere on Earth. This could explain most of the bizarre observations noted by conspiracy theorists. But this assumption brings us to a bigger question. If the US government could direct NASA to capture images on Earth and package them as if they were taken on the moon, who is to say they didn't make up the whole thing? What do you think about